So, let's talk about one of history's most infamous kings, Henry VIII. This is the story of how one man's personal obsession, his desperate need for a son, wasn't just a family crisis. No, it triggered a revolution that literally remade an entire nation.
Okay, so to really get the sheer scale of the changes Henry caused, you've got to understand the man himself. And wow, was he a contradiction. On one hand, you've got the young Henry, a total Renaissance prince. I mean, picture this. He's a patron of the arts, a gifted musician, a star athlete out on the jousting field. He was handsome, admired, the whole package. But then there's the other Henry, the one we see later in his reign, obese, paranoid, and just ruthlessly cruel.
All right. So to really grasp the scale of Henry's revolution, we need to step back and look at the world he was ruling. Tudor England. Well, it wasn't a place where you could just climb the social ladder or question the people in charge. Not at all. It was a kingdom built on this rock-solid belief in divine order.
And the way they saw this order was through something called the Great Chain of Being. Think of it like a giant ladder. Right at the very top, God. And just one step down was the king, his guy on earth, basically. Below him, you had everyone else, from the highest noble all the way down to the poorest laborer. Everybody had a fixed place, and that place was supposedly chosen for you by God himself. So to challenge that system, you were basically challenging God, and you just didn't do that.
And here's the really crucial part. This was a deeply patriarchal society. Power, titles, land, everything of value was passed down from father to son. So, if you're the king, this means you have one job that is more important than anything else. You have to produce a male heir to secure your dynasty. It's not a suggestion, it's your number one duty. So, that brings us right to the heart of the story, what they called the king's great matter. This was the one problem, the one obsession that would completely consume him. It drove him to do the unthinkable, to tear his own kingdom apart, all in the name of securing its future.
So what was the problem? It was this. After 20 years of marriage to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, they had only one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. And in a world that saw a ruling queen as a recipe for disaster, this wasn't just a letdown. It was a full-blown crisis. You have to remember, the Wars of the Roses, this absolutely brutal civil war over who should be king, wasn't ancient history. People remembered it. So a female heir, that felt like a direct threat to the Tudor dynasty's survival.
So, in Henry's mind, the solution was simple. He needed a divorce. He had to remarry and try again for a son, but there was one huge obstacle standing in his way: the Pope. Only the Pope could grant a divorce, and when he said no, well, Henry came up with a solution that was radical, unprecedented, and would change the nation forever. He decided if he couldn't win the game, he'd just change the rules completely. And the speed of this revolution is just staggering. I mean, we're talking about a few short years where Henry's government just steamrolled a wave of new laws that completely rewired the country. Suddenly, the king is the head of the church. Disagree with him? That's treason, and you're dead. Oh, and all that land and money the monasteries have? That's his now. He even passed a law saying his own royal proclamations were as good as acts of parliament. Just wow. The linchpin for this whole thing was the Act of Supremacy. With this one single piece of paper, Henry cut ties with the Pope that had existed for 1,000 years. 1,000 years. He didn't just get the divorce he wanted. He grabbed all religious and political power in England and put it right in his own hands. It was the ultimate power grab. But if you think the break with Rome was the end of the story, oh, not even close. In fact, it was just the beginning. This obsession for an heir kicked off this brutal, chaotic cycle that would plague the rest of his reign, and the consequences for his wives and his own children were devastating.
I mean, just look at the human cost of this obsession. It's staggering. First, he divorces Catherine to marry Anne Boleyn. But when Anne also gives him a daughter, Elizabeth, he has her executed on completely trumped-up charges. Then, his third wife, Jane Seymour, finally gives him a son, Edward, but she dies just a few days later from complications of childbirth. Divorced, executed, died. You start to see a pretty grim pattern here, right?
And this chaos spilled right over to his children. He basically used Parliament as his personal tool to rewrite the line of succession whenever he felt like it. First, his daughter Mary is declared illegitimate to make room for Elizabeth. Then, just a couple years later, he turns around and declares Elizabeth illegitimate too. He disinherited both of his own daughters. All that stability he was so desperate for, it was the one thing he couldn't create.
So, after all that, Henry finally got his male heir, Edward VI. But when Edward actually became king, he was only 9 years old. His reign was short, he was always sick, and the kingdom was really being run by his powerful advisors. This was not the strong, stable dynasty Henry had dreamed of.
And things get even crazier. On his deathbed, at just 15 years old, Edward tries to cut his Catholic sister Mary out of the line of succession. This kicks off a massive crisis. Protestant nobles stage a coup, and they put his young cousin, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne. But she'll only be queen for 9 days.
But the English people, they had other ideas. They rallied behind Henry's first daughter, Mary. She swept into power, kicked Jane Grey off the throne, and immediately got to work on her life's mission, to undo everything her father had done. She was going to drag England, kicking and screaming if she had to, right back to the Catholic Church. And she pursued that mission with fire. And I mean that literally. This number you see here, around 280, that's how many Protestants, men and women, were burned at the stake for heresy during her 5-year reign. That's how she earned that grim, unforgettable nickname, Bloody Mary.
So after all of this, all the turmoil, the bloodshed, the revolutionary change, it leaves us with the big question, right? How are we supposed to remember Henry VIII? Was he a man, a myth, or a monster? His legacy is, well, to say it's contested is a huge understatement.
Well, if you asked his biggest rival, Pope Paul III, the answer was pretty simple. Back in 1538, he just flat out called Henry a cruel tyrant. And from that Catholic point of view, that's exactly what he was, a heretic who wrecked the church just to satisfy his own selfish desires.
But then you flip that coin over, and you get a totally different picture. Fast forward a few centuries, and you have historians like A.F. Pollard calling him the most remarkable man who ever sat upon the English throne. For a lot of people, he's seen as the father of the English Reformation, the man who laid the groundwork for modern England. And this, right here, is the ultimate, almost unbelievable irony at the heart of Henry's entire story. Think about it. He obsessed over getting a male heir. He tore his kingdom away from the most powerful institution on earth and plunged it into chaos, all for a son. And what happened in the end? His son died as a teenager. And the future of the Tudor dynasty, it ended up in the hands of the 2 daughters he had declared illegitimate and cast aside.
So that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Henry VIII's personal obsession had world-changing consequences. There's no doubt about that. But was his turbulent reign a necessary evil? A brutal, violent process that ultimately created modern England? Or was it all just the tragic, destructive legacy of a tyrant? That's the question history is still debating.